Let me start by saying that I recommend this book to clients all the time, in particular because it talks in such detail about boundaries and resistance. And those are the two things that I'm really going to focus on tonight, unless you guys have more specific questions. Because boundaries, good boundaries, understanding boundaries, and understanding and letting go of resistance are two of the biggest elements that kind of get in the way, at least from my perspective as a therapist, of happiness, right? And I had another conversation. I was actually, somebody on one of my videos from this week, somebody asked the question, I think it was Mother Trucker, asked the question about, and I will make a video about this over the weekend. She asked about boundaries versus manipulation. And one of the most important elements to consider about a good boundary is, what is your intention? And I want to drill this into your mind. A boundary is about what you are going to do with a set of circumstances. A boundary has absolutely nothing to do with what other people do. And if you don't remember anything else from tonight, remember that a boundary has nothing to do with what other people do. Now, your boundary is going to be a behavior that you engage in. So the boundary, if you will, is kind of the mark, the line of demarcation for the activation of your behavior. Okay? And that's the thing that people constantly get wrong. If somebody says they're setting a boundary and what they're saying to you has something to do with your behavior, that's not actually a boundary. A boundary only speaks to what they are going to do. And so I think Funny Mother Trucker's question was about, can I talk about the difference between manipulation and boundaries? And a lot of people disguise manipulation in the form of something that they call a boundary, right? Manipulation is when someone tries to get you, directly or indirectly, to do something, right? There's some kind of enticement or behavior that is geared. The intention is for you to behave differently. That's not a boundary. If my intention and the goal is for you to do something different, it is not a boundary. Hey, Bonnie. So please try to remember that. If your intention is to change someone else's behavior, it is not a boundary. A boundary speaks only about what you are going to do. Anything else is an ultimatum, a manipulation effort, a request, right? But not necessarily a boundary. So tonight, I hope to really clarify that. And if you have any questions about how to word something, write it down or type it out, because this is the time. And I think if you have that question, people elsewhere in the conversation are going to have that question. And I think it would be really helpful to just go ahead and ask it. So she gets right in to the whole point of boundaries in the very beginning of the book. But by page 20, she is starting to talk about 25. She's starting to talk about boundaries. I'm not going to be able to read the book with these glasses. My reading glasses have some glare, so you'll have to forgive me. Yeah, there's glare, but we'll try to do this. So, like I said, I recommend this book because I think it's one of the best books outside of Dr. Cloud's book called Boundaries. And that book is super, super steeped in religion. And so I tend to stay away from it because a lot of people don't like the secular language. And even though there's some language in here, Dr. Cloud's is really geared for the Christian market. One of the things that is talked about over and over in this book is boundaries are limits. They're limits that demonstrate self-love, self-respect, and self-love, right? One of the reasons, again, that people have such a hard time setting boundaries is A, they don't clearly understand them. B, they're not committed to the consequence of boundary violations, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. And we don't really know what to do. Like, we're not prepared with an action when someone violates our boundaries, right? Boundaries require self-awareness, self-love, and honest communication. So let's start there. Boundaries require self-awareness. Those of you who are here all the time, those of you who have worked with me, you know that I am an incredibly strong advocate for self-awareness. Boundaries can't really even be established without self-awareness, because number one, you have to understand what you want. You have to understand the behavior you're willing to, the action you're willing to take and stand by once a boundary is violated. And maybe most importantly, you have to believe you are worth the boundary. So self-awareness and self-love are required and then communicating in really honest ways. I think I did a video this week about barriers to boundaries and the things that prevent us from setting boundaries. Repressing old emotions. I'm on page 27. Repressing old emotions, not really understanding our feelings, dependency on people, which is really interesting because if you're not afraid of being abandoned, you won't tolerate bad behavior. Now that's a double negative. So another way of saying that is you will tolerate bad behavior if you are afraid of being abandoned. And that's big, right? They are, Robin. So let me say that again. If you are afraid of being abandoned, you will probably tolerate bad behavior. For those of you who know my story, you know that my second husband, my first husband died. My second husband was a serial cheater. And the first affair that I became aware of was while I was pregnant with our youngest daughter. And I didn't really have validation of it until right after her birth. And I would have left, but I didn't feel like I had anywhere to go. I didn't believe that. Notice how I changed that, because I didn't feel like, that's not a feeling. I didn't believe I had anywhere to go. And I was desperate to be loved. And so my fear of abandonment right? Hey, Bree. My fear of abandonment kept me somewhat tolerant of bad behavior. And I think it's really important to understand that fear, and she talks about this in the book a little bit later, fear keeps us locked into feelings of unworthiness and resistance, right? Okay, more barriers. Having our boundaries violated as children, or not having, and shame, for sure, Jill, thank you for that. Not having boundaries as children, or our boundaries not being honored, and so we feel undeserving. Abuse, of course, not understanding our limits, and that's where self-awareness comes in. Poor parental role modeling. This is really big in enmeshed families, right? Enmeshment is an absence of boundaries, like a significant absence of boundaries. And when you grow up in, hello, John, when you grow up in an environment where there are no boundaries, hey, Amy, there's no example of what a boundary looks like. And so if you grow up in an enmeshed environment and you raise your family enmeshed, there's an absence of boundaries. And we don't think anything about it, by the way. Most of the time, it's a perfect example of you don't know what you don't know. And this is one of the generational trauma elements that are perpetuated generation after generation, because we often grow up believing that that's what love looks like. And so many times when I am working with somebody who is in an enmeshed environment, they don't really see it as an unhealthy. Typically what they know is they don't feel good. There's often some pain or abandonment that starts to rise that sends them to therapy. And then the discovery, hello, Tin, the discovery of the absence of boundaries, the awareness that starts to build, starts shifting all of these aha moments. And so in those situations, we're really starting right at the very beginning with what is a boundary. Hey, Stacy. So then we go to, so that's poor parenting or role models that can prevent us if we don't have examples to model by. Low self-esteem, poor communication skills, shame, as somebody mentioned, people pleasing. Those a bit, if I have to slow down because my brain's going really fast. People pleasing is a barrier to setting boundaries, because oftentimes when we set boundaries, somebody is going to be disappointed in us. They're going to be disappointed, and we may actually be discouraged or feel really discouraged about setting boundaries. And if we don't have a clear understanding of them, then we're going to give up, right? We're not going to do the things that have people feeling disappointed in us, because people pleasing is, and she talks about it a lot in this book, people pleasing is a way that we had our needs met as children. So one of the things that I really like about this book is that at the end of each section, the author has a series of questions for you to reflect on. And in the back of the book, there are a whole bunch of self-assessments that promote a stronger sense of self-awareness. Okay? So if tonight's conversation entices you and you decide you're going to read the book, don't hesitate to come back and leave questions on my content that are around any of the things that we're talking about tonight. Okay, so I said earlier that boundaries can often be confused with manipulation. And on page 32, she's talking about, is it a boundary or is it controlling? And one of the things she says that makes it very clear, hi Bella, Happy New Year to you, is it's not a boundary if we cannot enforce it. Just let that sink in for a minute. Especially think about this if someone else is attempting to set a boundary with you and you're feeling confused, right? Part of the confusion, I think, somehow comes with this idea that if somebody's trying to control our behavior and they call it setting a boundary, but they don't control us, we either feel like somebody's trying to control us, right? Or we feel scared that they're going to. If it's not enforceable, it's not a boundary. Try to let that sit there for just a minute as well. And this is another thing that's pretty interesting. She goes on to talk about if people have room to misinterpret, or if there is room to misinterpret, people will misinterpret it because we hear what we want to. We hear, listen carefully, we hear the things that cause us the least amount of pain. Okay? Just think about that for a second. We will hear, we will interpret what people say and do in such a way that the least impact is felt. Now, what's really interesting is I've talked to a lot of people who say, yeah, when they said that, my heart was broken. And so it seems like we interpreted it with the greatest painful impact, right? But I think ultimately our brains, remember, our brains are designed to keep us safe. And that's emotionally safe as well. And so, happy birthday, Robin. Really, happy birthday. Thank you so much for hanging out and sharing it with us. Think about your brain always attempting to help you survive. And emotional pain is part of our survival, right? So if there's room to misinterpret, people will misinterpret, which is why communication is so important. And in order to communicate well, you have to be self-aware. You have to know what you want. You have to be willing to enforce. Okay? I like this. So I'm on page 33. She says, enforcing limits can take creativity. It can take energy too. How much energy depends on how persistent the person is that we're trying to set boundaries with, and how consistently we have enforced boundaries before. And although it's not exactly the same, if you think, for any of you who are parents or you have nieces and nephews and you've taken them out for ice cream or you've been with them and they wanted a piece of candy or a Lifesaver or a lollipop or whatever it is, and you said no, no is the boundary. And you actually have the power to enforce, no, I'm not giving you more ice cream. But how persistent can a 6-year-old be? Pretty persistent. And how tired are you? And how tired you are is probably going to determine to some extent how quickly their persistent wears you down. For those of you with more than one or two children, you know that there's a huge difference between the enforcement of rules in child number 1 and child number 4. That's all I can speak to. I have 4. Number 4 did literally everything I ever said, none of my children would ever do. Because by the time she came around, I was spent. I didn't have any more energy. And so saying no, and she knew it too, saying no was almost a waste of my breath because I didn't have enough energy to back most of it up. At least not the way that I did with number 1. And that's a lot like any kind of boundary that we set, which is why we have to be conscientious about self-care, about the amount of energy we're willing to spend. It's why we can't have a hard line boundary on 400 different things. We have to really understand ourselves and know what's important for us. And then we have to make sure that we are rested and we spend that energy wisely. So if you've set a boundary with someone and they're persistent at pushing against that boundary, maybe you can't go out to dinner with them if you're exhausted because you know that you're vulnerable to letting them cross that line, right? It's one of the reasons I tell people all the time, don't tell your kids you're not going to Disney World. If you don't behave, we're not going to Disney World. You know that's not true. It's another reason why I think the whole elf on the shelf thing is crazy, because we're using the elf on the shelf as a fear tactic to manipulate kids into being good. Maybe not everybody. Maybe some people really just have fun with it. But the idea is that the elf is watching and reporting back to Santa, right? So, hey, Nick. I think it's really important to understand you to be self-aware in that regard. All right. Moving on to page 38. She's talking, I think, still about being able to hold on to your power. And I thought this was so poignant. She says, we don't have to yell to show our power. The more certain we are about our limits and our right to have them, the softer we'll speak. And, I've worked with people through the years who really didn't believe at the beginning of our journey that they had the right to ask for anything. That they were so either marginalized in their own mind, or they were so afraid of abandonment that they would not speak from a powerful place. And a powerful place isn't the power, right? The aggressive, assertive power. Power is certainty about our limits and our right to have them. That's power. And just think about that for a minute. Your personal power, the most power you can ever have, is certainty about your limits and your right to set them. Just think about that. I think it's really important to reconstruct your notion of what power is. Turning the page, she starts talking about, so I'm on page 40 if anybody's following along in the book. She starts talking about 100%, Robin, makes so much sense if you step back and look at it. She's talking about caretaking. And I wish I had $1 for every time I've talked about people pleasing and caretaking, and whether or not it was just goodness or whether or not it was unhealthy. And from a codependency point of view, taking care of others and neglecting yourself is what codependents do. One might say that's kind of the scarlet letter of codependency, is taking such good care of everybody else, but neglecting ourselves, right? It's pretty easy for me as a therapist to recognize codependency when somebody comes in and they talk about caregiving. They talk about how much they love their family and how much they give to the community and to everybody else. And then we start talking about themselves, and they're like, yeah, I'm not that important. And I'm like, codependency, right, in my head. Oh, codependency, well, we're going to work on that. The proverbial, you can't take care of other people well until you take care of yourself. That's why self-care isn't selfish, and then we could go down that rabbit hole, but tonight we're not going to. Why do people miss that? In many, many ways, and this is a really important sentence that I highlighted and exclamation marked, caretaking is what we think we have to do to be a good person. Now, I would ask you to really ask yourself, why do I take care of other people? Why do I give so much of myself to other people? Did somebody tell me I have to be selfless? Did someone tell me I was a good person if I was selfless? Melissa, you might have crossed my mind. But only because we've had this conversation, right, when you came to the retreat. So, and by the way, most caregivers fall into this trap at some point or another. If you are a professional caregiver, if you're a nurse, any caregiver, right? One of the tasks that is a challenge is understanding where that balance lies. If you're a mom, understanding where that balance lies. If you're a stay-at-home dad, if you're the star employee, where does the balance lie between making sure that everybody out here is taken care of and satisfied? Amen, John. And where I come into that picture, right? Here's another thing that caregiving does. It allows us to hide low self-esteem, low self-worth, and attaches us to people. Hi, Barbara. We qualify too, right? Any kind of caregiver. I think that this is pretty interesting because I see myself in that low self-esteem attachment phase. If I think about myself from a social perspective, when I was a kid, I was the fat kid with buck teeth who was picked last, right? And one of the ways that I learned I could be included was to take care of people, whether it was helping them with their homework, whether it was doing their chore in the classroom, right? It's that kind of provincial, classic, let me serve you so that you'll like me. And I, by the way, will have some value, or I'm going to garner my value as a way to do that. So that's another a place or another kind of origin for why people can develop codependency, at least in this arena. During the page, she talks about rescuing. And if I had $1 for every conversation that I've had in this regard, rescuing often helps people be irresponsible, negligent, or addicted. Now, isn't it interesting? Because if I just stop it with rescuing helps people. Yep. But codependency is highlighted when we help people do things that they are perfectly capable of doing themselves. So sometimes I'll talk to people, we'll say, like if I'm doing like a family counseling scenario, and dad feels unloved and left out because all of mom's energy goes to taking care of the kids, making a different meal for each one of them because they're picky eaters. My mother-in-law, my ex-mother-in-law, worked a full-time job. And before she left the house every day, she would make her retired husband lunch. And if she didn't make him lunch, he wouldn't eat. That's codependency. That's negative caretaking. Okay? So I think it's we're really talking about behaviors that some of us think are just kind and considerate. But that doesn't actually help him. He's staying at home. She's giving, and it's lovely, but it's to the extent that she's helping him be irresponsible or negligent of his own self-care. Right? We're not talking about somebody that, oh, she didn't make me lunch, or he was retired. It used to drive me crazy. Caretaking is often based on our need to be wanted and loved. And I don't know how to say it any more simply than that. It's not that caretaking is a bad thing. Thank you so much for that. It's really about when it goes above and beyond. Now, at some point in here, she talks about healthy caretaking. Oh, here. It was in here. There is a point somewhere between page 50 and 60 where she talks about healthy caretaking. Well, all right. She's calling all caretaking negative. She says caretaking, the unhealthy kind, isn't genuine acts of kindness and love that come from the heart. So that's perfectly fine. That's not codependent caretaking. Codependency is not fulfilling our true responsibilities to others. So if I've made you a promise and I fulfill that, that's not codependent caretaking. Codependency is not clear contracts to help in which all people hold up their end of the bargain. Codependency is not where both people give and take, where there's mutuality. Hello, fulfills a sense of purpose. Yeah, so the unhealthy kind of caretaking, if my purpose is solely based on what I can do for you, that's codependent caretaking. Codependency is not acts of service we do because to keep it, we have to give it away. So this idea that I'm going to, in order to have friendship, I have to be a friend, right? That's not codependent caretaking. That is a healthy kind of caretaking. So that's at the bottom of page 50. When you read that, make sure you understand that all the pages before that, she's talking about codependent caretaking. And so the label to this list is caretaking isn't. And she's really saying codependent caretaking is not all of these healthy things. All right, then we're going to go to, how am I doing? Wow, time goes so fast, doesn't it? The next section, I'm going to jump ahead about 40 pages. I'm going to talk about control. So listen carefully. A codependent person is one who has let another person's behavior affect him or her and is obsessed with controlling the other person's behavior. That's really, really important, right? Because one of the things that codependents can get in the habit of doing is kind of a covert control or manipulation in order to feel safe. Now, keep in mind, they're always still motivated by searching for that sense of safety. That doesn't change. All codependency is about fixing that sensation. Remember how we talked in the very beginning that codependency is born from this place of thinking that what we have to do this in order to be a good person, or we don't have enough self-worth just as we are, so we have to do all these things. And as long as I'm thinking either one of those things, I'm hurting. Those aren't good feelings, right? If I'm thinking that I'm not a good person, or that if I don't have enough self-worth, that I am okay without doing something nice, that's painful. And so what happens when we're in pain? Our brain says, oh boy, you need to engage in this behavior because that's going to feel better. You're going to feel better. So just like control helps us feel better, control is one of the mechanisms that we use when we have those kind of codependent uglies, if you will. Of all the behaviors that hurt us and destroy our love, our peace, our pleasure, creativity, relationships, etc., control takes first place. And I know I've shared this on my live before. People told me for years that I was controlling, and I simply did not believe them. I didn't believe them because I didn't really. Good night, Barbara. Have a wonderful night. My lives, by the way, for those of you who can only be here for a while, I eventually get them up on my TikTok channel, my YouTube channel, And so you can actually pick up right where we left off. You can catch the whole live on my YouTube channel. So check in there once in a while if you want to know how this ends. Anyway, I didn't know until I got to grad school that my behavior was a consequence of not feeling emotionally safe. Right? I really didn't care. I absolutely didn't care what other people were doing. I just knew what I needed in order to feel safe. And so what that looks like, I'll take a party, for example, right? We're having a big party. Maybe one of the kids is graduating and I have 80 people coming. There are a million things to do and I'm starting to feel panicked about it. And so I start barking orders and I want things done this way. Because in my mind, my value is somewhat based on how this party is presented and how it goes off. So that's codependency number one. If you like what I did, I'll feel more valued, right? If I can impress you with the party that I throw, I'll have more value. What happens though, when the potential of having value that way is threatened, I go into control mode. And if you're not going to do what I need done the way I want it done, then you don't have value to me. You only have value to me if you're going to do what I want, how I want it, when I'm in that mode, right? And again, that mode is about safety, emotional safety. I literally was sitting in a lecture one day and we're learning about anxiety, and the professor's describing all of this anxiety-based behavior. Remember, anxiety is fear. My fear was that people wouldn't have a good time. And if they didn't have a good time, I was the person to blame. And it was almost like how you see in the movies, right? That there were just these flashes of my life in front of my eyes. Identifying all the times that I had anxiety, that I went into control mode to preserve the outcome, so that the outcome would be what I needed it to be in order to feel safe. Does that make sense? And so if you see yourself there at all, it's really important to understand that in that regard, hi Kim, in that regard, control is a manifestation of anxiety, but the anxiety is fear of not being loved and accepted or thought well loved, blah, blah, blah. And that's, in many ways, a codependent trait. Now, keep in mind, all of us are just a little bit codependent. But for me, especially back then, and prior to going to grad school, my entire identity was wrapped up in this caretaking, people-pleasing mantra. From the time I can literally remember as a 9-year-old kid, and I picked up the toys, and my mother talked about it until the cows came home. And my mother was this woman who could emotionally and did ultimately even physically abandon us. But I was so invested in her approval that I did whatever it took to get it. And then the dopamine hits that came as a consequence of that approval almost became this way that I identified, right? So I want to make it really, really clear, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, but since I'm hitting some sensitive nerves here. Absolutely no judgment tonight. I meant to talk about this in the beginning of our discussion. When you read self-help books, you must do it without criticizing yourself. You must try to do it without going into that place of judgment, and just let it be education. That's it. Anxiety, approval, control. It's boom, boom, boom. So, all right. So we're going to keep going. Now, I know a couple of you really need to hear this. Love is when we let other people just be who they are. Okay? Love is when we let other people be who they are. I remember talking about, and I don't remember, I don't remember how long ago it was, maybe 2 years ago, and I saw a title of a book and it said, Love is Not Fear. And I know that I have trauma after my first husband died. I have this really intense trauma around accidents and abandonments. Rebecca, we're going to talk about that. I hope you'll hang out here for a minute. And I was so afraid that something would happen to one of my children that I am going to be really frank with you and tell you that I thought I was loving them, but what I was doing was inhibiting them. And it wasn't until I really understood that loving them was letting them be who they are. Now, that goes both ways, right? And to your point, Rebecca, this doesn't fully describe it, but to your point, loving, so if somebody else wants you to be somebody different, that's who they are. They're people who don't see you. They're people who don't accept you. And loving them somewhat unconditionally, right, is accepting and loving that these are just people who want you to be different. Do you hear that? Like, sometimes loving people and letting them be who they are means that they're not going to be who we want them to be. Because if I am not loving you because I'm not who you want me to be, then I'm actually just reflecting that right back at you. Right? Which can be really hard sometimes to take in. And then they boot you out of their lives. But if these are people, and I don't mean to be crass, but if these are people who need you to be somebody different, then why are they in your life to begin with? And if they're family members, that's when it gets crazy hard. That's why I have a job. Because I would tell you that that's not love. I mean, I am telling you, and she's telling you, and almost every self-help book that's written on this topic tells you that the truest form of love is acceptance. Even when you hate what you're having to accept. But that's actually just resistance, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Okay? Okay. So if anybody's following along in the book, I'm on page like 97, 98. The biggest reason we control is fear. I talked about that already a little bit. Here's another interesting thing, and I know somebody needs to hear this. Control is also a part of grief. Just let that sink in for a second. What happens when we think we're going to lose something or we have lost something? And let's talk about family, right? That family, if we're afraid of losing our family, it's completely and totally natural, albeit unhealthy, to go into control mode. I didn't mean healthy, I meant normal. It's completely and totally normal to go into control mode, right? Yes, the truest form of love is acceptance. Because when we go into control mode, we can reduce our fear. Now, if we're facing loss or if we have lost, we're going to feel grief. Does grief feel good? No. What do we organically do in order to feel better? We try to control. If I could just control this, I would feel better. And part of that control means they can't do what they're telling me they want to do. I talked about this a year and a half, 2 years ago, when my youngest daughter was getting ready to travel the world during, in the midst of a global pandemic. And I was so afraid. I was so afraid for her. She was doing solo travel as a young woman. Oh, my kids have taught me so much. And some of you were around then and listening to me talk about this. What did I try to do because I was afraid? I tried to control what she was doing. And it wasn't that I tried to control whether or not she went, but I started researching things. I started telling her, telling her what she should do and where she should stay. And finally one day she just looked at me and said, "Mom, don't you trust me? Don't you think I'm smart? What are you doing?" And then all of a sudden I thought, what do you mean, don't I? Yes, of course you're smart. Yes, you're capable. But that's not what I was telling her by my behavior. And my behavior was communication, right? All by itself, my behavior was communication. And I really had to sit back and start thinking about, what was I afraid of? I was afraid she was going to get hurt, or she was going to be halfway around the world and I wouldn't get to her. And then I had to remember, well, she's a 25-year-old, very capable woman. She certainly has lots of evidence for that. All of the things I was doing weren't about her at all. They were about me. They weren't about her. Yeah, I did. I needed to let go. And I did. And ultimately, the way that I did that was by accepting that this is what she wanted for herself. And my fear was my responsibility to process. And it worked out well. And, I learned a lot. I processed a lot. She was empowered and had an amazing journey. And it worked out well. But it worked out well because I'm just going to honor myself and say I was brave enough to see it clearly and to see my responsibility in that and to let it go so that she could be empowered to take the journey she needed to take as a young woman. And that's hard. And it's so hard, especially when our kids take a journey that is something, and I don't even mean literal, right? They could be next door and be taking their own kind of journey that we have no comprehension of. And maybe even more importantly, that a journey that is so different from the one that we thought they were going to take, and that's where the grief comes in, right? And for those of us who go through the experience of people we love engaged in or doing things that we don't understand, we don't agree with, we're afraid of the outcome, all of that is an instigator of grief. And when we feel grief, for many of us, the need to control is a mechanism where we start to manage that grief. And thanks, Melissa. I think that certainly if I hadn't become a therapist, if I was the same woman, if I hadn't grown, if I hadn't taken that journey, 20 years ago, I might not have, I think I would have lived too much in fear, right? But I sat down and I started reading every self-help book I could find. And I really want to have you hear that so much of this is just being open to the idea of taking personal responsibility, because it's not about the other person. It's grief. So grief is something, and grief is, Kim, is the response to any potential or perceived or realistic loss, experienced loss, right? And that can be the loss of anything. It can be the loss of a vision in our own mind, even if it was something we totally made up. It could be the loss of a job, of a house, of a person, of a pet. It can be anything. And when we feel grief, it's pain. And what do we instinctively want to do? We want the pain to go away. One of the ways we can get the pain go away is to try to control the outcome, right? And when we try to control the outcome, we go into all of these other problematic behaviors. So I'm just going to read you this paragraph because I thought it was so important. Control is also a part of grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross defined the stages of loss as denial, anger, negotiation, sadness, and acceptance, or peace. Control is the negotiation part. Now just think about that for a minute. Control is the negotiation part. You know what? If you do this, I'll do this. I need you to do this so I'll feel better. Control is the negotiation part. We're trying to make a deal and make the feeling of loss go away. How about that? I think that's really interesting, and I know that that's going to resonate with somebody. So then she starts talking about surrendering. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not seek its own. That's how the Bible describes love. Love is presence and awareness, says Eckhart Tolle. Love happens after our hair has been rubbed off and our joints are wobbly. Love makes us real, says the Velveteen Rabbit. We don't learn, so now we're talking about surrendering, and I'm at the bottom of page 99. We don't learn surrendering and letting go by following rules or intellectualizing. We learn about surrendering and letting go by going through all of these experiences that we didn't know were coming. And again, I really want to have you think about this, right? Because we learn from those experiences that we didn't know were coming. So many of those experiences that we didn't know were coming are the ones that hurt. And yet that's where the learning takes place. In the end, we learn that love is the only thing that's real. Love isn't control. It's not even close. It doesn't matter if you understand what I'm saying. If you don't, someday you will, she says. Ultimately, it's the only lesson we're here to learn. And have you heard that before? Right? I mean, that is kind of my mantra, that love is the thing that we are here to learn. This kind of love. The love of letting go. The love of acceptance. In the hundreds of books that I've read over the last 20, 30 years, I've said before that the theme, regardless of who the kind of what genre it starts, whether it's spirituality, self-help, psychology, they all kind of point to the idea that our job as human beings in the advancement of humanity is to learn love. And again, not romantic love, but the kind of acceptance, the love that we're talking about. Yeah, lots and lots of challenges. All right. Just as controlling is an action and an attitude, so are surrendering and letting go. Ooh, after losing your 16-year-old son, and began very OCD behaviors. Yeah, I'll bet. That, what an incredible loss for you. I'm so sorry. And OCD is an anxiety disorder. Anxiety is fear. And when you've had a trauma like that, of course you're going to be afraid. I understand. The idea that somehow I can, yes, exactly. I totally understand. So let me keep going. Thank you for sharing that, Rebecca. Control makes us feel tense, rigid, and uncomfortable inside, and safe. Resignation makes us feel hopeless. So when we say, I guess it's never going to change, that's resignation, and that's going to help foster hopelessness. Cold detachment creates bitterness, meanness, a sense of uncaring, insensitivity, and callousness. It closes our hearts. True surrender and detaching in love brings perfect peace. And, you know, I think that her philosophies are rooted in a lot of Buddhist ideologies. She talks in the beginning of the book about having some roots in Gestalt therapy. For a little while, she was an addictions counselor, and she was an addictions counselor back in the 80s. And Gestalt was very big back then. And Gestalt is rooted in Buddhist philosophies, but so are a lot of other things. And a big part of Buddhist philosophy, at least from the psychology of it, not the religious part, but the psychology of it, the spiritual part, is true surrender and detaching. So if we talk about, I don't know, I think I go all the way back, because she doesn't spend a ton of time talking about what surrendering and detaching is. But surrender is the acceptance of what is. And I was thinking about this today. Yes, 100%, John. I used to be afraid to fly. And I mean, the fear comes from a couple of really lousy flights. I had 3 flights kind of all in a row over the course of a couple of, well, probably a year and a half. And in one flight, we had to do an emergency landing. In another flight, we skidded off the runway. And then in yet another flight, we were in a thunderstorm and lightning was... My memory is lightning traveled down the aisle inside the plane. That was probably an overreaction, and now it's just a story in my head. But it was scary nonetheless. So after those 3 flights, I just developed this acute fear of flying. And I used to have to fly up to New York. I lived in Virginia, and I had to fly up to New York quite a bit. And that was back in the day when they had the flight schedules in printed books in the seat pockets, right? Which I get such a kick out of now. And I would pick up the book and I would say, these flights take off every day from every airport all around the world, and nobody crashed yesterday. And that would get me kind of through the short flight to New York. And then when my son moved to Europe, I found myself going to Europe a couple of times a year. And going across the Atlantic, it can get pretty bumpy. And I found that if I was on like United and I could hear the pilots talking to flight control, that I understood that they had asked to change altitude. So if the plane was going down a little bit, or if it was going up or bearing, I could kind of understand. But when Frank moved to Europe and I had to start taking cheap flights, United was not usually an option. And I got afraid again. Until one day I realized that the pilot was probably pretty invested in getting home to his or her family also. And I remember sitting in the plane, starting to feel the anxiety, and completely and totally surrendering to the pilot wanting to get home too. And it was that simple. It was a complete, here, you take it. I trust that you're going to want to get home too. I just gave him. Isn't that funny? It's funny when I hear it, because it's like, what else was I going to do? I can't fly the plane. But I just gave him control. But because literally, metaphorically speaking, I'm sitting in the back of the plane trying to control what happens to the damn plane. And all of that attempt at controlling was causing all of this stress, tightness, heart racing. And the minute I gave up having control, I just gave him control of the plane, the control he had from the get-go, it all went away. I can just sit there and relax. Just gave it away. Control that was never mine to have in the beginning. And I know I'm talking about a plane, but that same ideology applies across the board. right? Theoretically, that's the whole premise behind let go and let God, right? So whether God is some heavenly being, or whether it's the universe, or whether it's let go and let the pilot, it doesn't really matter. It's letting go and giving up this thing that was never yours to control in the first place. And when I really, really think about it, I just kind of giggle. Because what the heck was I going to be doing from the back of the plane? 100%, John. And she talks about that in the book too, about having faith that each experience is a lesson. And I've talked about this somewhat repeatedly in my lives over the last several years. I believe that everything happens for a reason. And hey, Jackie, and if we can, that's very hard to hear when you're talking about somebody who's focused on tragedy or trauma. And I've heard all of the arguments against that philosophy, and I validate that it's an incredibly difficult idea to hold, especially if you've lost a child, or you're thinking about things like the whole Holocaust, the wars, and the unjust actions, school shootings, etc., etc. And yet, what's also true from someone who has a variety of different traumas is that I can point to every single one of those experiences and tell you that if I let go, if I step back from the judgment of those experiences as being good, bad, right, or wrong, then I can see that something in those experiences offered me something to learn. Whether it was the death of my husbands, I've lost 2, whether it was the betrayal of from my family, the death of my parents, you name it. When we say everything happens for a reason, I think it's somewhat easier to swallow if we can say that there's something to learn in every experience. Now, is that 6 1/2 dozen another? Maybe. But going on, because there's more, and I can feel myself running out of steam, and it's 10:20. I'm telling you, a lesson or a blessing. These lives go so fast, and I could talk about this stuff until I'm literally out of breath. She goes on. Now, I skip like 100 pages because she has a ton of assessments that she goes through. And one of the things she talks about is how many of the questions in the assessments can be used as affirmations. For example, here's a question, and this is kind of a true or false question, or a scoring on a 1 to 10, but you could use this as an affirmation. I can completely deal with anger. I know when I'm feeling it, and I know feeling it isn't wrong. I can feel whether it's justified or not without feeling guilt. I can express anger without attacking and with love. And I know, Melissa, I have like this much left. It's probably going back in the bottle. So anyway, if you have the book, that's a good section to also pay attention to. All right, so then she fast forwards and she talks about feelings. And I talk a lot about feelings on here. But she uses a catch and release metaphor that I think is really great. And the catch and release metaphor of feelings is there are some feelings that pop up and they're too meaningless. There's not enough with the feeling for it to be substantial, and not that it doesn't feel substantial, but it doesn't fit anywhere substantially, if that makes sense. And because it doesn't fit, you get to put that feeling back, like, nah, I'm not gonna, this doesn't have a place for me. Kind of like that puzzle piece. I've used the puzzle piece metaphor. And I pick up this puzzle piece, and it's a big, it's like, ooh, this is a real puzzle piece. This is it. But if I'm looking at my life, I don't see anywhere that this feeling that was just laying here on the table, and it's very real, but it doesn't fit the present puzzle. This puzzle piece is actually left over from a different puzzle, from a different time. I don't know how it got in this box, but it doesn't belong in this box. So I'm going to put it over here and leave it there. Hello, Mac Long. All right. And so she's talking about feelings. And then she's talking, the way to get feelings out is to catch and release. When we used to go fishing, we pulled every fish, blah, blah, blah. We should kill them. That's all we need to do with feelings. We can deal with a feeling in less than a minute, although it might take a little longer, once we learn this catch and release trick. We release the feeling and the old belief, and life teaches us something new. Which is, think about this for a minute. If I use the catch and relief model, right, and I decide, I'm just, the whole time I'm sitting there with this little fish, this feeling, I'm not free to get a different one until I release this one. So think about that for a minute. If I am hyper fixated on something, and I don't release this feeling from my hook, and I just keep throwing it, every time I reel it back in, the same damn fish is going to be on the hook. I have to take the fish off and throw it out there before a new fish can get hooked. I have to process, dispose of, accept, stop judging, release, whatever you want to say. I have to do it to this feeling before I can have another one. Okay? It's on audiobook, John. That's how I read it first. She says, we release the feeling and the old belief, and life teaches us something new. Then along comes another emotion called another belief and a new lesson. It's natural. It's a natural, organic process of spiritual and emotional growth. We don't control the process. Life grows us. Resistance. Resistance is denial of what is. Resistance, judgment, and assigning values such as positive, negative, right, and wrong to feelings, and talking about feelings endlessly will often turn emotions into a bigger deal than necessary. Hope you heard that too. Resistance to and judgments about emotions can make them unpleasant and hurt more. Let me just say that one more time. Resistance to and judgment of emotions can make them grow and hurt more. If you're going to set an intention for this year, okay, good, good. I'm just going to say it one more time. Resistance to and judgments of emotions can make them unpleasant and hurt more. The more skilled we become at surrendering to the feeling, the quicker we tag the fish and get it back into the water. The easier feeling emotions becomes. Non-resistance neutralizes the pain. The second we stop caring what feeling is in us, the problems from feeling the feelings are eliminated. Should I read that again? The second we stopped caring what feeling is in us, the problems from feeling the feelings are eliminated. Doesn't that sound so stinking simple? Really? Judging emotions as positive or negative, good or bad, also makes them more complicated. So every time we hear, oh, I shouldn't be thinking like this, we're making it more complicated. Every time we say, why do I keep holding on to this? We're making it more complicated. That's resistance and judgment. All feelings are the same. Think about this. All feelings are the same. Yes, surrender to the feeling and release it. It doesn't matter what the feeling is, they're all the same. The only thing that distinguishes the feeling is our judgment and attachment to it. The second we stop judging the emotions, we surrender to what it is, and we breathe it out, it's gone. Doesn't matter what the feeling is. By the way, that's also true of joy. How many times have you found yourself saying, I don't deserve to be this happy? There it is. There's a judgment of happiness. There it goes. Bye, happiness. Doesn't matter what the feeling is. It's interesting. She says there's as much difference between angry and excited as there is between purple and green. They're both colors. Different, but the same. We might have personal preferences, but they're all just different feelings on a color wheel. Hi, Maddie. How are you? So that's the end of what I have highlighted. She goes into a couple of other things, but I am out of time. And I just want to say to you guys, first of all, I hope that you were taking notes. I know it's 10:30. My light's going to go off any minute. I love doing this. The next book I would like to do is Big Magic. Hold on a sec. Oh. See how late it is? My light goes out. So this is Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. And you're welcome, everybody. Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. This is also one of my favorite books. I did do a book club on this about 2 years ago, and it was great. And the reason that this is one of my favorite books is because I think that it takes a lot of the principles in here and puts them into maybe a more abstract form so that you can allow it to take whatever shape it needs to take for your life. Great, but it's a lie. What's a lie? So, I hope that you were taking notes, and if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. And just, you are welcome. Everybody is so welcome. Please don't hesitate to leave a comment on one of the videos that I put up this week about boundaries. I think that it's a great place to ask the question, especially because so much of the book was about boundaries. And by all means, hop into another live and ask away, because I did all the talking tonight. So I hope you guys have a great weekend. Don't forget, if you are a Tilt fam member, our Zoom call is Sunday night at 8 o'clock. And you have a wonderful, wonderful weekend to everybody. Thanks again for being here and hanging out with me. Good night.